They called it the King of the Low Seas, the shadow that skimmed just above the breakers, the machine that carried a ship-killing weapon under its belly and the lives of 3 men inside its armored shell. It wasn't glamorous like a fighter, and it didn't thunder like a dive bomber. But in the quiet calculations of admirals and the whispered concerns of sailors watching the horizon, it was the torpedo bomber that inspired fear. Because if one of these aircraft lined up on your ship, steady and unwavering, it meant a battle could be decided in a single shattering moment. This is the story of that weapon, that era, and ultimately, the rise of the Torpedo Titan that would conquer the oceans of World War II. Before the Pacific ignited into a canvas of flames and carriers, before radar screens hummed and naval doctrines shifted like tides, the idea of a torpedo bomber already carried a strange mix of hope and dread. For navies dreaming of extending their reach, an aircraft carrying a torpedo promised a revolution. For battleships, once the undisputed giants of the sea, it signaled a coming vulnerability. And for the pilots and crews who volunteered to fly these slow, low-running machines, it demanded a courage that sometimes bordered on recklessness. No other mission required an aircraft to dive into the very jaws of the enemy, flying straight and level, giving gunners the easiest shot they would ever take. Torpedo bombing was a gamble with survival, but in that gamble lived victory. On the eve of the global conflict, nations experimented wildly with designs. Some clung to outdated biplanes whose fabric wings whipped in the wind. Others pushed metal monoplanes with new engines and retractable gear. But no matter the technology, the challenge remained the same. How do you drop a torpedo from the air without ruining it? Aerial torpedoes were fragile instruments. Drop them too high and they broke upon hitting the water. Drop them too fast and they spiraled or sank. Release them at the wrong angle and they veered wildly off course. To be effective, a torpedo bomber had to creep in close, almost hugging the sea's surface. It had to be stable, predictable, and able to withstand punishment long enough to deliver its cargo. This combination was rare. Few aircraft could claim it. Even fewer could claim mastery. As war erupted, it became clear that torpedo bombers would decide the fate of fleets. At Taranto in 1940, British biplanes proved that battleships were no longer invincible. At Pearl Harbor, Japanese strike groups demonstrated how lethal a coordinated torpedo attack could be. And in the dark days of 1942, American torpedo squadrons learned with bitter sacrifice how unforgiving the mission could be. The oceans transformed into battlegrounds where speed, steel, and courage collided. Each nation believed it had built the ultimate sea killer, the one that would dominate maritime warfare. But as the months turned into years, the frontline truth became clear. Only one aircraft would rise above the rest, one that combined raw strength with refined engineering, one that crews trusted with their lives. But before that Titan arrived, the contenders took their place in the spotlight. They were the pioneers of a deadly craft, each stepping onto the stage with hopes of rewriting naval history. Their victories and failures would shape the aircraft that followed, and their legacy would become the foundation upon which the Torpedo Titan would be built. The first to etch its name into wartime, legend was a machine that looked like it, belonged in a museum more than a war zone. The British Fairey Swordfish. It had the skeletal wings of a bygone era and an engine that sputtered rather than roared. Its fabric-covered skin rippled in the wind, and its maximum speed barely exceeded that of a modern car. But it carried something far more important than speed: adaptability. It could take off from small decks, it could operate at night, and it had pilots who treated its weaknesses as quirks rather than flaws. When the clouds parted over the Italian naval base at Taranto, it wasn't the fastest or most modern plane that changed the balance of naval power. It was the slow, deliberate Swordfish. Slipping through spotlights and flak, they dropped torpedoes with a precision that stunned the world. They didn't just damage ships, they damaged the myth of the battleship. The Swordfish proved that courage and strategy could overcome technological inferiority. But victory had a cost. As the war advanced, the Swordfish found itself outmatched by faster enemy fighters and thicker webs of anti-aircraft fire. It had been perfect for a moment, but that moment faded. Across the Pacific, Japan presented its own contender, the Nakajima B-5N, known to the Allies as the Kate. Sleek, streamlined, and modern by pre-war standards, the Kate was a torpedo bomber built for coordinated carrier warfare. Its speed and range made it ideal for long-distance strikes, and its weapon, the Japanese Type 91 torpedo, was arguably the most reliable aerial torpedo of the early war. The Kate's moment came on a quiet Sunday morning at Pearl Harbor. As the first torpedo planes slipped across the harbor entrance, skimming the water, sailors who glanced up saw formation descending with a deadly precision that few, navies had prepared for. The Kates launched their torpedoes with mechanical discipline, striking battleships built to survive storms, not aerial torpedoes. It was a defining moment not just for Japan, but for the entire concept of naval air power. The Kate continued its deadly work at the Coral Sea, at the Java Sea, and at the Indian Ocean raid. But time, technology, and attrition are relentless opponents. As Allied fighters improved and Japanese losses mounted, the Kate's lack of protection became its downfall. Early brilliance turned into late war fragility. Then came an American machine, one that symbolized hope and heartbreak. In equal measure, the Douglas TBD Devastator. When introduced, the Devastator was considered revolutionary, sleek, durable, and technologically advanced. But by the time it faced the crucible of Midway, advances in enemy aircraft and defensive fire made it painfully obsolete. Torpedo Squadron 8 Flying Devastators launched into the teeth of Japanese carrier defenses with almost unimaginable bravery. They flew low and straight, enduring swarms of Zero fighters and walls of tracer fire. One by one, they fell from the sky. Not a single Devastator from their squadron survived. It was a tragedy, but within it lay the seed of salvation. The sacrifice of the Devastators drew Japanese fighters down to sea level, leaving their carriers vulnerable to the American dive. Bombers arriving moments later, the Devastator became a symbol of bravery more than success. A stark reminder that a torpedo bomber must be more than bold. It must be built to survive. The failures and successes of these early aircraft created a blueprint, what a torpedo bomber must be, and what it must never be. It needed range, because in the Pacific distances stretched for hundreds of miles. It needed armor, because crews deserved a fighting chance. It needed power, because speed meant survival. And it needed flexibility, because the war was changing too quickly for a rigid design. As the lessons of 1940, 1941, and 1942 echoed across ship decks and design rooms, a new machine took shape across American factories. It was not just another entrant. It was a response to every mistake, every triumph, every loss. Engineers saw what was needed. Pilots knew what they wanted. The war demanded something better. And so the Torpedo Titan began its ascent. It wouldn't debut with a myth-making victory like the Swordfish. It wouldn't shock the world in a single devastating attack like the Kate, nor would it enter the war as a revolutionary prototype like the Devastator. Instead, it arrived quietly, powerful, heavy, patient, a machine that didn't need to prove itself with miracles, because it carried within its wings the distilled truth of every torpedo bomber that came before it. It was born not from hope, but from necessity, not from glory, but from blood. As the year 1942 unfolded, the stage was set. The oceans were waiting. The fleets were ready. The war demanded a champion, not the fastest, not the newest, but the most complete. The Torpedo Titan would become that aircraft. But its rise would not be measured in propaganda or patriotic slogans. Instead, it would be measured in the quiet confidence of crews who stepped inside its fuselage and knew, perhaps for the first time, that they had a fighting chance to return home. The rise of the Torpedo Titan did not begin with fanfare or sweeping headlines. It began with a cold understanding inside design rooms and Navy board meetings. If America wanted to fight a carrier war across an ocean as vast as the Pacific, it needed an aircraft that could fly farther, hit harder, survive longer, and adapt faster than anything that had ever taken off from a wooden flight deck. It needed muscle, brains, and the durability of a hammer. And in 1941, as storm clouds thickened over the Pacific, Grumman Aircraft Engineering Corporation was already shaping the answer. Grumman was known for building sturdy machines, aircraft, that mechanics trusted and pilots respected. Their designs were never the lightest or the prettiest, but they were built with the same philosophy as naval ships: strong bones, rugged skin, and systems that worked even when the world was falling apart around them. When engineers laid the first lines of the new torpedo bomber, they didn't aim for elegance. They aimed for survival. Every inch of the blueprint carried that intent. The aircraft that would become the Titan was larger than its predecessors, longer, wider, heavier. It was so big that it barely fit inside some carrier elevators during its initial tests. Ship crews joked that it looked like a flying warehouse. But inside that hulking frame lived something precious: space for a three-man crew, room for a reliable power plant, and a bay designed not just for a torpedo, but for bombs, depth charges, auxiliary fuel tanks, and later, cutting-edge radar equipment. This was not a specialized tool. It was a platform, a promise that it could evolve as the war demanded. Its engine, a powerful Wright R2600 twin Cyclone, gave it the muscle that earlier torpedo bombers lacked. Heavier armor protected vital areas. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the chance of catastrophic fires. A powered turret sat behind the pilot, turning the plane from a helpless target into a defended machine. Even the landing gear was designed with ruggedness in mind. If this aircraft hit the deck of a carrier too hard, it wasn't the plane that would break first, it was the deck. But power and durability meant nothing unless the aircraft proved itself where it mattered most, in the furnace of battle. And that furnace was waiting. When the first production models rolled out of Grumman's factories in early 1942, the war in the Pacific was reaching a crisis. Japanese carriers dominated the region. American naval forces were struggling to hold lines across scattered island chains. The stunning losses at Pearl Harbor had crippled battleship strength. The only hope lay with carriers and the aircraft they carried. The arrival of the new torpedo bomber came at a moment when desperation and determination intertwined. Pilots trained relentlessly, some knowing that the aircraft they practiced in would not be the one they fought in. Crewmen studied maps of distant islands they had never heard of. Air squadrons learned how to coordinate with dive bombers and fighter escorts in ways no doctrine had ever predicted. The Pacific was becoming a laboratory for survival. When the new torpedo bomber was assigned its official designation, TBF, later TBM under General Motors production, few understood how profoundly it would shape the war's outcome. Its first major test came at the Battle of Midway, though its numbers were small. Only a handful were present, freshly delivered, barely shaken down. Yet even this early glimpse hinted at something different. During the battle, one lone aircraft from Torpedo Squadron 8, flying from Midway Island, pressed an attack alone against the Japanese fleet. It had no escort. It faced 0 fighters and anti-aircraft guns by itself. The pilot, Ensign Albert K. Ernest, and his crew held steady, ran the gauntlet, and dropped their torpedo. Flak ripped through the fuselage. Shrapnel tore into the men. The radio man gunner was killed. The turret gunner's leg was shattered. The plane limped back to Midway trailing smoke. Barely controllable, yet it made it home. Damaged beyond recognition, but alive. That survival was not luck. It was design, thick armor plates, redundant systems, and a tough engine that refused to die. Men remembered that. Stories of the lone survivor spread through naval air groups like wildfire. Pilots whispered a phrase that would become attached to the aircraft forever. "She brings you home." As more Avengers, now the common name for the aircraft, arrived in the Pacific, their presence changed the feel of the flight deck. They were bigger than previous torpedo bombers, and their silhouettes against the sunset gave the impression of a giant lifting its shoulders. Crews worked around them with a mix of respect and awe. Mechanics marveled at how easy they were to service. Armorers appreciated the generous bays. Radiomen loved the space to work their equipment. And pilots loved the way it felt in the air. Heavy but stable, strong but controllable, a beast that obeyed. By late 1942 and early 1943, the Avenger began carving its place in the island-hopping campaigns. In the Solomons, where jungle-covered islands hid airstrips and supply depots, the Avenger struck with precision. It dropped torpedoes against Japanese transports. It bombed airfields. It hunted submarines that prowled the dark waters like sharks. Whenever a carrier group prepared for an assault, Avengers lined the decks with a sense of inevitability. These were not fragile machines. They were sledgehammers. Their first major opportunity to change the tide came in the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Avengers launched against Japanese carriers, threading through layered defenses. Torpedoes were released, and though the results were mixed, it was clear that this new aircraft was no longer the easy prey its predecessors had been. Pilots reported taking hits and continuing their attacks. Gunners shot down fighters that thought they were attacking a helpless target. More importantly, the aircraft began to prove something no other torpedo bomber had mastered: versatility. The Avenger didn't just adapt to missions, it absorbed them. It could carry torpedoes, yes, but also 500-pound bombs, 1,000-pound bombs, depth charges, and anti-submarine ordnance. It became the Swiss Army knife of naval aviation, able to shape itself for whatever task the war demanded. As radar technology matured, the spacious fuselage made it ideal for carrying new airborne radar sets. Suddenly, ships were not the only targets. Submarines hiding beneath black waves felt a new predator circling above. Meanwhile, Grumman continued refining production, but wartime demand exploded. The U.S. Navy needed thousands, not hundreds, of Avengers. Carriers multiplied across the Pacific like stepping stones. Escort carriers, smaller and more numerous, began to carry Avengers as their primary strike aircraft. They guarded convoys, protected amphibious invasions, and hunted submarines with relentless efficiency. The aircraft that had once been designed for torpedo runs became the backbone of naval aviation strategy. But no matter how effective a machine is, It becomes legendary only through the actions of the men who fly it. And the Avenger, in the hands of American crews, began writing a story of persistence and transformation. Instead of dramatic one-shot victories, it built its reputation through mission after mission, across scattered battlefields, from the heat-soaked decks off Guadalcanal to the storm-lashed seas near the Aleutian Islands. Pilots trusted it in crosswinds, in darkness, in rain squalls that swallowed the horizon. When a carrier group had to launch strikes in miserable conditions, the Avenger was the aircraft sent first. It handled rough seas and unstable decks with a stoic calm that no fighter could match. The war was changing. Battleships, once symbols of absolute power, now relied on aircraft to survive. Fleet carriers became the queens of the ocean, projecting their wings like claws across hundreds of miles. And in those wings, Avengers lined up in rows, engines growling, torpedoes slung beneath them like silent threats. Japanese commanders began to fear the silhouette of the Avenger. They understood that this was no flimsy pre-war machine. This was an instrument built for endurance. By mid-1943 and early 1944, the Avenger was participating in some of the most significant turning points of the Pacific War. In the Gilbert and Marshall Islands campaign, Avengers softened defenses ahead of landings, bombed troop concentrations, hunted shipping lanes, and provided the type of tactical reach no earlier torpedo bomber could deliver. And as American forces pushed closer to the Japanese homeland, the aircraft evolved once again. New variants arrived with more powerful engines, better electronics, and improved payload capacities. Radar-equipped Avengers began patrolling vast stretches of ocean, seeking submarines, early warning picket boats, and surface raiders. What made the Avenger unique was that its growth felt natural, inevitable. It was not being asked to do more than it could handle. It simply had the room, the strength, and the structural intelligence to evolve. Meanwhile, Grumman had become so overloaded with production demands that General Motors stepped in, producing TBM variants in massive numbers. Assembly lines worked day and night. The U.S. industrial machine roared like a furnace, fueling an aircraft whose reputation grew every month. If a carrier left port, it carried Avengers. If a convoy sailed across the Atlantic or Pacific, Avengers circled overhead. If a submarine stalked the depths, Avengers hunted it from above. The era of fragile torpedo bombers was over. The Titan had arrived, and the enemies of America's fleets were beginning to understand that no sea, no storm, no night sky offered safety anymore. The Aleutian Islands were a lonely frontier, windswept, fog-choked, and so brutally cold that engines froze solid, if left uncovered for even a few minutes. But after Nyland's daring reconnaissance flight exposed the Japanese plans, this remote chain of volcanic rocks suddenly became the center of a storm neither side had prepared for. And in the first days of August 1943, the Americans faced a terrifying truth. The Japanese weren't retreating. They were regrouping, quietly, efficiently, and with an ambition far greater than anyone had predicted. American intelligence estimated a modest garrison on Kiska, a few thousand soldiers, maybe less, worn down by isolation, eager to escape the miserable conditions. But what the U.S. didn't know was that the Japanese had already begun a massive and secret evacuation, using the thick Aleutian fog as their shield. It was, by every definition, one of the most audacious operations of the Pacific War, and it began under a cloak so dense that entire fleets vanished into it like ghosts. But the Americans didn't realize any of this yet. They were preparing for what they believed would be another Attu, a merciless, grinding battle where the enemy would fight to the last man. The memory of Attu still burned. Soldiers had watched their own comrades collapse from exposure, starvation, exhaustion. They had seen the final banzai charge, men, with bayonets and knives storming into machine gun lines with nothing left to lose. No one wanted a repeat of that horror. Yet commanders insisted the Japanese on Kiska would fight with the same desperation. No one expected an empty island. No one believed the Japanese could evacuate thousands of troops without being caught. And so, as American ships churned north and infantry divisions rehearsed beach landings, an eerie silence settled over Kiska, a silence no one interpreted correctly. But far from silent was the Japanese evacuation. Flotilla, destroyers slicing through freezing waters, navigating blind through fog thicker than smoke. Every man on board understood the stakes. The Aleutians had become a death trap, and if American submarines or bombers caught them, thousands would die in minutes. Their survival depended on timing, discipline, and weather. And astonishingly, the weather delivered. Sheet after sheet of gray fog rolled across the sea, enveloping the destroyers like a giant hand shielding them from the sky. The Japanese moved quietly, swiftly, almost rhythmically, boarding troops with remarkable coordination. Officers whispered orders. Engines were muffled. Signals were limited to handheld lamps barely visible a few meters away. They knew American patrols were nearby. They knew radar-equipped P-38s and B-24s prowled overhead. But the fog turned those predators blind. And so, while U.S. commanders prepared for a massive invasion, the island they were studying so intensely was emptying hour by hour. By mid-August, the Japanese had completed the near impossible. They had rescued more than 5,000 troops from under the noses of American air power. It was an operation that would puzzle Allied analysts for decades. How could a force with total naval and air superiority fail to notice an entire enemy army slipping away? The answer was simple. Everyone expected a fight. No one expected a disappearance. But the Americans didn't know any of this as their armada approached. Kiska, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, transport ships, radar pickets, escort carriers. It was one of the largest invasion forces of the Pacific War, assembled to crush an army that was no longer there. And yet, despite the absence of defenders, the landings began with tension so thick it seemed to float above the waves. Fog surrounded everything. Visibility collapsed to just a few meters. Voices seemed to echo strangely in the mist. Soldiers couldn't see the water beside their landing craft, much less the shoreline. They felt their way forward, weapons shaking slightly in their hands. Every sound became suspect: the crash of waves, the rattle of loose equipment, the moan of wind across volcanic rocks. And then it began. Gunshots from the darkness, explosions, mines, tripwires, booby traps carefully planted by the retreating Japanese. Soldiers dove for cover, firing into the fog at shapes that weren't there. Units got separated. Some even fired on each other. The fog turned the invasion into a nightmare of confusion. By nightfall, dozens of Americans were dead, killed not by Japanese defenders, but by accidents, misfires, hidden explosives, and the brutal terrain. It was a battle without an enemy, and yet the danger felt sharper than ever. "Where are they?" one commander whispered after hours of searching. Where the hell did they go? But slowly, piece by piece, the clues emerged. Abandoned camps, still warm ashes from cooking fires, fresh footprints, medical supplies recently used, all signs of a large garrison that had left not long before the Americans arrived. And then the realization struck like a blow. The Japanese were gone. A shockwave of disbelief rippled through the ranks. How had thousands of men vanished without detection? How had the Americans been outmaneuvered in conditions where they supposedly held every advantage? The answer lay not only in the fog, but in something far more surprising: Japanese mastery of Aleutian survival, discipline, and timing. The U.S. Navy underestimated them. The Army assumed they would fight to the end. No one imagined they could execute such a precise evacuation under constant threat. But while shock rippled through the American command, something else happened too, something far more dangerous. A narrative began to take shape. A suspicion, a fear. If the Japanese could vanish from Kiska, could they be preparing an even larger attack elsewhere? Were they gathering strength for a counterstrike? Whispers ran through the ranks. Some soldiers insisted they had heard voices in the fog, Japanese scouts hiding in caves. Others claimed to see silhouettes moving among the rocks. Patrols fired into the mist at phantom figures. The island became a psychological battlefield, even though it was physically empty. And when a patrol stumbled upon a massive underground tunnel complex, complete with food stores, ammunition racks, and reinforced chambers, the tension soared. This wasn't the work of an army in retreat. This was the work of an army prepared for a long-term campaign. Only one thing stopped it: orders from Tokyo to withdraw. But there was another discovery, one that sent shivers through every officer who saw it: a half-finished airstrip carved directly into the volcanic soil. Long-range plans cut short only by strategy shifts. And suddenly, it hit everyone. If the Japanese had completed that airstrip, the entire North Pacific would have been at risk. This revelation changed everything. The Aleutians were not a distraction. They were a potential launching point, a threat corridor, a reminder that the war in the Pacific had more fronts than anyone wanted to admit. The Americans realized how close they had come to facing a fortified island capable of projecting air power deep into Alaska. The Japanese realization was even sharper. They could not hold the Aleutians. The terrain was too brutal, the supply lines too fragile, and the American industrial machine too powerful. But both sides learned something deeply unsettling. The fog-covered frontier could change the fate of entire strategies. And yet, even as American forces secured the silent island, something else was taking shape: an investigation, a hunt for answers, a search for the truth behind the mysterious disappearance. And at the center of this inquiry stood the man whose discovery had changed the course of events. Lieutenant William Nealand, his reconnaissance flight had revealed the Japanese plans. But now he faced a question even deeper and more troubling. If he hadn't warned them, would the Americans have walked into the greatest trap of the Aleutian campaign? Because deep in one tunnel, buried beneath crates of unused explosives, the investigators found instructions, plans, schematics, detailed diagrams for coordinated explosive traps that could have annihilated entire battalions if the Japanese had chosen to stay. It was a ghostly reminder. The enemy didn't leave because they were beaten. They left because they chose to. And somewhere across the Pacific, Japanese commanders sifted through reports of the evacuation, analyzing every detail. The operation was a success, but it also signaled a transformation. They knew the Americans were learning faster, adapting faster, striking faster. The war in the Aleutians had shown them the limits of what fog and terrain could hide. But deeper questions lingered. Why had Tokyo ordered the withdrawal? Why abandon a foothold that had cost thousands of lives to secure? The answer lay in a shift happening thousands of miles away. A shift that would soon reshape the entire Pacific. New priorities, new fears, new battles emerging over the horizon. And as American troops lit their campfires across Kiska, unaware of how close they had come to disaster, a greater storm gathered beyond their knowledge. Because the Japanese withdrawal from Kiska was not an end. It was the beginning of something far more dangerous. Dawn broke over Kiska with a pale metallic light, cold, thin, and indifferent. The fog still clung to the island, drifting in slow, eerie waves that made the world look half-formed, like a memory fading at the edges. The American troops, exhausted from navigating an empty battlefield, now walked among the remnants of an enemy that had slipped through their fingers. Yet even as they uncovered abandoned machinery and stockpiles, the most unsettling discovery lay in what wasn't there. There were no bodies, no wounded, no stragglers, not a single Japanese soldier hiding in the volcanic crags or collapsed buildings. It was as though an entire army had evaporated. American commanders stared at their maps, baffled and angry. They had expected another Attu, another desperate, bloody struggle where every hill cost lives. Instead, they found silence. And that silence carried humiliation, confusion, and a shadow of dread. Because if the Japanese could vanish from Kiska, what else could they do? What other movements could they conceal behind weather and terrain? That question weighed heavily on Admiral Kincaid, who stood aboard his flagship looking out into the grayness of the Aleutian Sea. He knew the truth now. The fog was their greatest enemy. It had shielded Japanese destroyers, blinded American patrols, and turned reconnaissance into guesswork. It was a battlefield that obeyed no human command, and the Japanese had mastered it. Aboard other ships, the mood wasn't triumph but unease. Officers whispered among themselves. Men traded rumors that the Japanese had escaped through tunnels, or used submarines hidden beneath cliffs, or simply dissolved into the mist. They knew these theories were absurd, yet the emptiness of the island made rational explanations feel thin and unsatisfying. On the ground, engineers and intelligence teams began their meticulous search. They moved slowly, careful not to trigger the many traps left behind. Someone stepped on a pressure plate. A mine detonated. The noise echoed across the volcanic slopes like a cannon blast. For a moment, everyone froze, thinking it was the start of an ambush. But once again, no enemy followed. Just the fog. The investigation quickly uncovered the scale of Japanese preparation, interconnected, tunnel networks, supply depots carved into cliffs, fortified positions with fields of fire overlapping like woven cloth. This wasn't the work of a demoralized force. This was engineering for a siege, a plan for months, even years of resistance. The realization sank in. Had the Japanese chosen to stay, the Americans would have bled for every inch of this island. But Tokyo had changed strategy, and that pivot, though invisible to the men standing on Kiska, was shifting the entire momentum of the Pacific War. While U.S. troops combed through ruins, a thick envelope of intelligence documents made its way to Washington. It contained detailed findings, photographs of Japanese bunkers, diagrams of the unfinished airstrip, and reports of the shockingly clean evacuation. Analysts pored over each detail with growing alarm. For months, they had believed the Aleutians were a sideshow, cold, distant, strategically minor. But now they understood how close. The Japanese had come to turning the North Pacific into a launching point. A fully operational Japanese airbase on Kiska would have forced the U.S. to defend Alaska with far more resources. It could have harassed naval convoys, threatened the Pacific coastline, and disrupted supply routes vital to the Soviet Union. And if the airfield had been completed, the consequences, military planners realized, could have been catastrophic. Meanwhile, across the ocean in Tokyo, The evacuation of Kiska was studied as a rare success. Admirals who had spent months exchanging bad news finally had something to report with pride. They had extracted thousands of men under the enemy's nose. But beneath this success was a harsher truth. They had withdrawn not because they were beaten, but because the war was shifting to a new phase. Japan could no longer afford isolated outposts. They needed to consolidate, concentrate, and brace for the storms gathering across the Central Pacific. Back on Kiska, the Americans dug deeper into the tunnels. In one chamber, dimly lit by lanterns, they found a wall covered in inscriptions. Japanese handwriting, dates, names, notes about missing comrades, letters never sent, poems about home. One line caught every translator's eye. "May the fog hide us until the sea takes us home." It was eerie, beautiful, haunting, and it captured everything the Aleutians. Campaign had become a battle fought as much against nature as against each other. But the Americans had another mystery to unravel. Several weeks before the landing, Lieutenant William Nyland's reconnaissance flight had detected unusual troop movements. His report had triggered urgent warnings, frantic planning, and a massive invasion force. But now, analysts wondered, had his flight also accidentally alerted the Japanese? Had the presence of American aircraft accelerated the evacuation? Nyland didn't have answers. He had been following orders. He had made the right call at the right moment. But in military history, timing is everything, sometimes more powerful than bullets or bombs. And the timing of his flight was about to become the subject of heated debate. As the investigation expanded, a new theory emerged. Japanese radio intercepts suggested the evacuation order had already been in motion, but Nyland's flight may have confirmed, for the Japanese, that the Americans had discovered their preparations. Whether or not that was true, the idea created tension within Allied intelligence circles. Was it possible that a single pilot's courage had prevented a deadly trap? Or had he inadvertently sped up the enemy's withdrawal, denying the Americans a decisive victory? Opinions shifted daily. Some argued Nyland saved thousands of American lives by preventing a bloody showdown. Others believed he had allowed the Japanese to escape unscathed, letting them fight again on other islands. But one thing was certain: his flight changed the course of the Aleutian campaign forever. Nyland himself watched the discourse unfold with quiet unease. He didn't want credit or blame. He knew what he saw. He knew he did his duty. And the war wasn't over. Debates meant little compared to the storms of combat still ahead. On Kiska, as August faded, the fog thinned. Sunlight pierced through in rare, golden shafts, revealing the rugged beauty beneath. Soldiers stood atop cliffs, staring out at the endless gray sea, imagining the Japanese destroyers slipping silently away. Somewhere out there, those same ships were now part of new battles, new fronts, new tragedies waiting to unfold. Months later, when the full story of the evacuation became clear, it astonished everyone. Japanese destroyers had navigated blindly, weaving through American patrol zones with miraculous timing. They had retrieved entire units in hours. Not a single ship had been lost. The scale, precision, and audacity of the operation stunned Allied commanders who had assumed the enemy was cornered and desperate. But the greatest shock came from one final revelation. The Japanese had left food cooking, rice still warm in pots, fires still glowing, half-written messages left at tables. They had departed mere hours before the Americans arrived. The two armies had been separated not by miles or days, but by a handful of hours and the thickness of the fog. That truth settled into the American military consciousness like a chilling whisper. The Aleutians were never a forgotten side theater. They were a reminder of how quickly advantage could shift, how invisibly plans could move, and how even victory could feel hollow when the enemy left no trace. In Washington, the Aleutian lessons reshaped air strategy. Radar became priority. Long-range patrols increased. Night operations improved. The military realized it must adapt to an enemy skilled in deception and unpredictability. In Tokyo, the evacuation cemented a new doctrine: flexible retreats, strategic withdrawals, and the preservation of veteran units for future battles. Those soldiers saved from Kiska would later fight in the Central Pacific, their survival altering clashes that had yet to come. And for the men who walked the volcanic valleys of Kiska, the memory would linger for the rest of their lives. A battlefield where no bullets flew, yet danger lurked in every rock, every step, every whisper of wind. A campaign where the enemy was both present and absent, seen and unseen. A campaign defined not by fire but by fog. Years later, historians would call Kiska the Ghost Invasion, a battle without an opposing army, a victory without triumph. A campaign that showed how war could twist into shapes no one expected. But for the men who were there, for the soldiers stumbling through misty landscapes, for the sailors staring into blank horizons, for the airmen who risked their lives in freezing skies. The Aleutians would always be a reminder of something deeper. War isn't always decided by force. Sometimes it's decided by timing, by weather, by a single decision made in the gray light of dawn. And in August 1943, on an island swallowed by fog, two empires learned that truth the hard way. If you enjoyed this documentary, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more incredible World War II stories. Don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. It really helps support the channel.